Tonight on Primetime Politics, teachable moments.
Now we have 74 days to finish the term, our term. Let's make every day count.
As the U.S. president promises a peaceful transition for Donald Trump, many Democrats are now blaming Joe Biden for not leaving sooner. Is there a lesson in that for the Prime Minister? We'll speak to our political strategists. Also, as European leaders meet in Budapest, we'll examine the impact of a second Trump presidency on global security and international alliances. And
this is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged.
Equality rights in the United States in the wake of a Trump victory. The president of the U.S. National Organization for Women will join us. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. U.S. President Joe Biden spoke from the White House Rose Garden today, speaking to Americans for the first time since his vice president Kamala Harris's defeat in the presidential race, promising a peaceful transition of power for Donald Trump, the man who tried to interfere in the democratic process nearly 4 years ago.
We're going to be okay, but we need to stay engaged. We need to keep going. And above all, we need to keep the faith.
Democrats had been hoping to avoid this, but instead of celebrating a victory and planning another Democratic term in office, the party is now engaged in a blame game, asking what went wrong, and many pointing the finger at Joe Biden, who only stepped aside in the last few months of the campaign. So, are there any lessons for Canadian politicians in what happened south of the border? To talk about this, we're joined by our political strategist. Susan Smith is a former Liberal strategist, co-founder and principal of Bluesky Strategy Group. Cole Hogan is a conservative digital strategist and a principal at GT & Company. And George Soule is former NDP Director of Communications, now principal at Syntax Strategic. Hello to the three of you.
Hello.
Okay, so that is the premise, first and foremost. If there are any lessons in this for Canadian politicians, and to be frank, for the Prime Minister, because Joe Biden was being told to step aside long before he actually did, and by stepping aside late, there was no primary, and then Kamala Harris has to pick up the campaign late in the game. So is there a lesson in this for the Prime Minister?
Well, I think runway for an election campaign is always important. So there's certainly an argument to be made that the longer time between when a leader steps down and the next election, the better. Although, you know, the Ontario Conservatives would argue that you don't necessarily need a runway. When Doug Ford came in, I don't know, seconds before people went to the ballot, when in his first term, you know, and going through the ashes of an election campaign is the definition of confirmation bias. I mean, everyone's going to say the reason that we didn't win is because we didn't do the thing that I think we should have done. You know, because there's another argument to be made, frankly, that if Biden had stepped down much earlier, then they would have had a possibly very divisive primary, and then maybe the Democrats would have gone off on a different foot. So I think it's easy to blame one way or the other. I think when you come to Canada, it's just the point that the writing's on the wall. The biggest issue in the next election will be anybody but Justin Trudeau. And if you ask any Canadians, yes, they're worried about affordability. Yes, they're worried about healthcare. Yes, they're worried about their kids' education. But primarily, they just don't like the guy that's got the job right now. And so I don't think whether it's short or long or whatever, I don't understand the argument for him to stick around. I do think, quickly on this though, I do think that, not knowing him very well at all, or at all, but I do think that this might reinforce Justin Trudeau's belief that only he can beat Poilievre in this election, because only he can stand up, in his mind, can stand up to Donald Trump.
Okay, we'll get to that in a second, actually. But Cole, what do you think? I mean, is there a lesson here when you look at Joe Biden again right now being blamed for staying too long to the detriment of the party in the presidential campaign? What do you say?
Yeah, I think trying to compare the two, I think, you know, sticking with an unpopular leader late into the campaign or the run-up to one is always going to be a drag on your electoral fortunes. And I think, you know, even if the Liberals did replace Trudeau at this stage, I think his successor still wears a lot of his political baggage. And I think when we look at a lot of this stuff too, I think that if you pay too much attention to American politics and try to transpose it onto Canadian politics and say, okay, this worked in the States, so maybe it'll work here, I think that's when you can politically fail. So I'd always advise against watching American politics too closely.
Okay, Susan?
Thank you for that, Cole. I think all of us are still trying to recover from American politics this week, and we'll be recovering for most of the year. I think there are some parallels, but there are also some definite differences. If I'm the Liberal government, it was the economy, stupid, and that was a key component. And I think the Liberals need to dial right into that message and find a way to tell the story that's super clear. Where people say an unpopular incumbent and popular incumbent, perhaps, where the difference is 80-year-old gentleman who clearly did not have the capacity to keep going versus a 50-something-year-old Trudeau who has stood up to Trump before. And now we know the outcome of the U.S. election. And so I think, George, there will be a bit of that contemplation. You know, can Poilievre, who's never run a corner store or led a major file, stand up to Trump, or can Trudeau, who's done it and landed the NAFTA deal, do it again? People will try to draw comparisons. Some are apples to apples, some are apples to oranges.
Okay, well, let's go to that then, because you've already raised, you know, who can take on a Trump presidency best, who can actually meet the challenge of the moment. Is it a Trudeau? Is it a Poilievre? George?
Well, we know for sure that Donald Trump doesn't like Justin Trudeau, and we know that Justin Trudeau doesn't like Donald Trump, and that's one thing upon which I cannot blame him, or for which I can't blame Justin Trudeau. I don't like Trump very much either. I think it's going to be interesting. It's going to take a team. You know, we have seen the Liberals now set up and try to put on a stronger front. They've put together the committee that they had the last time Trump was president. Dominic LeBlanc as well as Chrystia Freeland are both going to play senior roles on that committee. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I do know you have the type of government and the type of people and actual individuals that Donald Trump looks down upon the most, right? So I mean, I think it's going to be a real challenge for the Liberals to do it. And if I'm being quite frank, I don't think any of the three party leaders will be in a great shape to take care of Donald Trump. He's going to do what he wants to do, and I am worried about the lack of guardrails they have this time. In the past, they were able to build relationships with some kind of quasi-reasonable people that are in his inner circle, and I don't think we're going to see those people this time. So the biggest thing we're going to need is somebody that can understand the country and take care of Canadians and do what we can when we can with the Americans. But I think it's really going to be focusing on our country. And, you know, we've heard all three of them talk about jobs, and that's going to be a big deal. As we come to the new trade deals and trying to avoid tariffs, we're going to have to make sure that we're protecting Canadian jobs as well, and that needs to be the #1 issue, I think.
Cole?
Yeah, I watched a lot of the Canadian coverage of the American election earlier in the week, and you know, I don't think it's super helpful to anyone for us as a country to be consistently hyperventilating about the results. I think we've been here before, and we'll brave these waters again. And I think I look at Chrystia Freeland and Jagmeet Singh getting up and saying, you know, a lot of Canadians are anxious. And, you know, there's some rightful claim to that statement. And I think your mileage may vary in terms of how nervous you want to be. But I think it's time to put a brave face forward and, you know, march on consistently and sort of put forward a different face on this instead of, you know, woe is me, the end is near. So I think we'll see a different conversation coming out from, you know, the government itself. And in terms of political moves, I think we'll see some people try to compare Poilievre to Trump. I don't think Canadians, when polled and generally, think that there's any similarity between the two. And when I looked to Ontario in 2018, I distinctly remember, because I was on the Conservative campaign, Kathleen Wynne getting up and saying, Doug Ford isn't like Donald Trump, he is Donald Trump. Well, no one believed her. That didn't work. The Ontario Liberal Party ended up in 3rd place, politically irrelevant at times. So I think if the Liberals and the New Democrats try to pin, you know, Trump on Poilievre and say they're the same guy, they're headed for the same result.
Susan?
It's too bad that we have that convoy footage of Pierre Poilievre. It's something they didn't have with Doug Ford. And I think they're very different people. Look, Pierre Poilievre is not Donald Trump. But he likes his playbook, and the people around him like his playbook. With regards to Canada and trade, who's best to handle Trump, it helps if you've been in the ring before with him. And I think Canada has a double-pronged strategy or a multi-pronged strategy. Some of it ordinary Canadians aren't going to see, and that's the outreach to governors and to mayors and the business-to-business outreach, and that's the only way to really get through to Trump. It's not leader to leader, unless you're Putin or someone he admires from a strongman thing. Trump is going to be Trump and grandstand and seek his win and get his deal no matter what. The one thing I think that Mr. Trudeau one thing in particular Mr. Trudeau has that Mr. Poilievre doesn't have is the nuance that comes with diplomacy. And we saw it, when Biden came to town and Poilievre didn't get his invitation or had his chance to speak and whined, right? There is some nuance that has to take place when you're the leader of a country and when you're trying to manage relations between the country. Mr. Poilievre has to learn that. I don't think he's learned that quite yet. So I would have more confidence in Trudeau on that front. But Trump will be Trump, and George, you're right. No guardrails this time. No former generals there. I just read George Stephanopoulos' book about the Situation Room. It's a really good read, and Trump's take on that and his failure to use it and just do what he wanted for the photo op or for the reputation or the win is quite frightening, in fact. So I think the Deputy Prime Minister reassuring a few Canadians, that's a good thing. But you're right. Our economy is our economy. We all need to pull together, and that's what happened in the last CUSMA negotiations. And I hope that all leaders of the opposition and all premiers, regardless of stripe, will pull in the same direction for the Canadian economy.
Do you think that's possible, given how close we are to an election?
I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure they'll behave themselves.
Okay, quickly on both that thought. Do you think that's possible this time around?
Sure, I think the premiers can, Doug Ford works with Chrystia Freeland, the Prime Minister, just fine when they need to.
He'll be well behaved.
Yeah,
it's a few of the others.
The message that they put out there will work just properly, and I think that's because in Ford's case and with others, they're more focused on cost of living issues, which is a common theme in the American election. So I think we'll hear that from conservative premiers and Poilievre going towards the next election.
Okay, last word to you, George.
Yeah, and I agree, actually, particularly in Ontario with steel and the auto industry. There's lots of things that we're not to really work on that border. So I think Ford will do what he can to get the federal Conservatives on board as well to work together, and I hope that we're able to do that. That's going to be key. I think the last thing I'm going to say, though, is all of this, when talking to Canadians and getting ready for the next election, I think the biggest lesson we can learn from the States, because we've seen it provincially, is that the high-minded, elitist-type politician aren't getting the support they used to anymore, and so people need to learn. All politicians need to learn how to really talk to folks where they're at.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that you're talking to folks here. So George, Susan Cole, thank you for this.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, as the current U.S. president promises a peaceful transition, European leaders are also busy making plans, meeting in Budapest today to discuss common challenges, including a change in power in the United States and a president in Donald Trump, who, the last time he was in office, created great tensions in the transatlantic relationship. Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Roland Paris. He is a former Foreign Affairs advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. He's now a professor and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Roland, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Listen, I want to begin, not surprisingly, in Budapest today, because we did hear from the gathering of European leaders in Hungary, and they have essentially committed to increase their defense spending so that they can mutually defend Europe without depending on the United States. How much of that is an expression of concern about Donald Trump?
I think it's very much an expression of concern because they're very aware of what he's been saying for a long time, which is that Europe and Canada, other members of NATO, should be paying more for the security of NATO as a whole and less reliant on the United States. So I think it's a little bit of preemptive appeal to Donald Trump. But it's not like this is new, because even the Biden administration and previous administrations have also been calling for greater contribution from allies.
Interesting, because as you say, it is consistent, except that with Donald Trump, he's been very direct about it. Certainly was the first time he was president. And when you think about his first presidency, he was surrounded by several different advisors who talked about foreign policy with him. And when you hear from his former security advisors, those people were able to keep him away from his worst instincts. But here we are, in 2024, hard to tell with whom he'll actually surround himself this time around. What concerns do you have there?
Well, lots of them. And, he's impulsive. We know that. We've seen that many times. He has played with the idea of withdrawing the United States from NATO, whether that was just a bargaining ploy or genuine. It's very difficult to say. So on the economic side, on the security side, and many different dimensions of U.S. foreign policy, I think that there are big questions about what he might do. He's likely to be less restrained than he was the first time, not just because he'll have fewer people around him who have a different view of the world, but more generally because he's already been president once. He seems to be a little angrier, a little bit more vindictive in his comments on the campaign trail. The attempt to hold him accountable for some of his actions not only effectively failed, but led to a Supreme Court decision that says that he's essentially immune from criminal liability for anything that he does while he's in office, and he never will run again for president. So I think that anything is possible, and we need to be ready for an extremely unpredictable 4 years.
You use the word unpredictable, and of course, one big question is around Ukraine. There has been talk from Donald Trump about ending the Ukrainian war. His brag is he could do it in one day. He has this pre-existing relationship with Vladimir Putin. In fact, according to Bob Woodward, the journalist, Putin and Trump maintained communications even after Trump left the White House. So I wonder if Ukraine's fight to stay independent is now in trouble.
Yeah, I think that this is really a difficult development for Ukraine. As you say, Donald Trump has said that he would end the war in 24 hours. He's never said what his plan would be to end the war. J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect, has offered some ideas about freezing the battle lines in place and providing Russia with a guarantee that Ukraine would never be a member of NATO, but we don't know whether what J.D. Vance said represents Trump's thoughts at all. The risk here is that he's said that he could solve this problem very quickly. And on the other side is Vladimir Putin, who's not under the same kind of time pressures. And the danger is that Donald Trump will effectively sell Ukraine out and force them into an agreement with Russia that gives Russia basically the territory that it's conquered and doesn't create enough of a security guarantee for what's left of Ukraine going forward. And he could force Ukraine to do this by effectively making continued U.S. support of Ukraine contingent on Ukraine agreeing. Who knows what's going to happen? But I should say that there are some people in Ukraine who are hoping that, that there'll be something unexpected coming from Trump in a positive way, because they were getting quite worried about how things were heading with the Biden administration. So time will tell.
Yeah, time will tell, as you say. The other front that we're keeping a close eye on has to do with, of course, the Middle East. President Trump's electoral win was apparently welcomed by the Israeli Prime Minister. We saw him turn to social media. And reportedly, Trump told Netanyahu, and this was back in October, to do what you have to do as he engages in military operations in Gaza and Lebanon. How do you think Trump's election changes the dynamics of the Middle East?
Well, I think it helps Benjamin Netanyahu in a significant way, because even though the Biden administration has not really placed very significant constraints on Netanyahu, it has imposed some constraints, even as recently as saying that there would be restrictions on weapons transfers if more humanitarian aid wasn't allowed to go into the Gaza Strip. Now, Trump has essentially said that he was criticizing Kamala Harris for calling for a ceasefire. Trump said that the Biden administration was forcing Israel to fight with one hand tied behind its back. As you said, he has said that Benjamin Netanyahu knows what he's doing and should be allowed to do what he wants. On the other hand, Trump has also said the killing must come to an end and that Netanyahu should achieve victory quickly and move on. And so it's unclear exactly how what position he will take on this conflict going forward. But I think that this does, at least in the short, maybe even medium term, provide Benjamin Netanyahu with even more flexibility and maybe also consolidates his political position in Israel as well.
Mm-hmm. So questions about Israel, questions about Ukraine, questions about NATO. Where does that leave Canada, Roland, in terms of trying to navigate foreign policy with the United States being our closest and nearest ally?
Well, there's a set of questions about how we manage our bilateral relationship with the United States, which is obviously a matter of absolutely central interest to Canada. And there's also a question about how we're going to be managing our foreign policy beyond North America in relation to these changed circumstances. On the bilateral level, the last Trump administration was a three-alarm fire for Canada's national interests, primarily because of our economic dependence on the United States. The fact that we not only send 76% of our manufactured goods to the United States, but that hides the reality, which is that our economies are intertwined. And so there were a lot of unexpected developments during the first Trump administration, including his threat to tear up the NAFTA, including tariffs on steel and aluminum and other threats. And Canada had to be very nimble in heading some of these problems off, activating relationships that Canadian government and other Canadian actors had throughout the United States. That is something that's going to have to happen again, but we don't know what's in store for us this time. The first challenge might be if Trump announces across-the-board new tariffs on imports in the United States, as he's threatened to do many times. That will be a very significant challenge for Canada.
Well, an uncertain road ahead. We're all watching very closely. Roland Paris, thank you for this. Appreciate for the time.
Thank you.
Well, time now for a look at what else happened in politics today. Canada's Environment Commissioner Jerry DeMarco says the government is not doing enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. New audits conducted by the office say Ottawa has acted too slowly and have also overestimated the impact of several government initiatives. The goal is to achieve a reduction of 40 to 45% of 2005 levels within 6 years. The NDP is calling on the government to abolish closed work permits for migrant workers. At a press conference, NDP MP Jenny Kwan highlighted abuses that can occur in closed work permits where foreign workers are tied to one employer in order to stay in Canada.
The reality is, if you're tied to one specific worker, employer, you are really at their behest to do what they demand of you, no matter what the abuse is, no matter if you're faced with wage theft, with harassment, with violence, for women, with sexual harassment, you just have to live with it.
Earlier this year, a UN Special Rapporteur called Canada's system, quote, a breeding ground for contemporary slavery. TikTok Canada is being ordered by the federal government to wind up its business in this country. The move follows a national security review that flagged risks associated with the popular app. In particular, concerns with its parent company, ByteDance, which is based in the People's Republic of China. TikTok Canada says the decision will cost hundreds of jobs and will be challenged in court. Despite the move, TikTok will still be accessible to Canadians even without a Canadian office. And finally, Ottawa and the Manitoba government are organizing a public funeral for the late Senator Murray Sinclair. A longtime advocate for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis rights, Sinclair is best known for chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and for challenging Canadians to confront the truth and horrors of residential schools. The public funeral will take place Sunday at Winnipeg's Canada Life Centre. You can watch it right here on CPAC beginning at 3 p.m. Eastern. Well, back to the United States, where many Democrats are still coming to terms with Tuesday's loss, with some seeing Kamala Harris's defeat as a repudiation of a qualified candidate because of her race and gender. It's an issue I spoke about with Christian Nunes today. She is the U.S. National President of NOW, the National Organization for Women, a group that described Trump's victory as being fueled by racism and misogyny.
So when we look at the exit poll numbers and we look at what transpired in this election, we noticed a couple different things happen. Overall, we know that Vice President Harris ran a very great campaign, a very positive, unifying campaign for democracy, and talked a lot about care economy, about entrepreneurship, about protecting our freedoms and our rights. And when it came down to it, we saw that with the abortion ballot initiatives to restore and protect abortion rights in many states, 7 out of 10 states approved and passed those measures. But in those same states, majority of those states, not all of them, they also still voted heavily for Donald Trump as president, because they also felt that to them, maybe economy and the language that he spoke was more in alignment with their values. But it doesn't make some sense. It's a paradox to say that a person who's running on a campaign to restrict and take away women's rights and bodily autonomy is the best candidate for women. And when we also see that he's doing everything in his power to create and continue to oppress and take the rights back of those from marginalized communities, it makes no sense why we have individuals who continue to support and vote for him. And so those exit polls show that even with the blue wall that we were expecting to see, that he received majority of the support in those blue wall states, and typically would vote on a Democratic side. So we have to look at this. Why would this occur when we had a candidate that ran a very strong campaign, really hit her points, had a policy, but still she showed up with lower votes for women. More women voted for Trump this time than before. We had less support from the Latino community. We had less support from the Asian AAPI community. And we just kind of look at these results and see, and even with the Gen Z population, we see there was a divide between Gen Z women and Gen Z men. So looking at all that, there's no way that we cannot deny that sexism and racism played in this. When you have the strongest candidate who's overly qualified running for office, but yet she turns out and receives lower support in very important areas that typically vote for progressive candidates, there's nothing else that you can call it.
So what do you do about that then? What does that tell you about the challenge that still remains for equality rights, and how arguments that you and others make are being perceived by many of the American population?
Well, I think it's an honest conversation that we have to have, right? And sometimes people get very uncomfortable with honest conversations. But if we are going to truly work toward increasing, the safety and freedoms of every person in this country, we have to have this honest conversation. And we have to talk about why are we holding women at different levels of accountability that we're holding men in this country in political offices, in corporate positions, and everyday positions. We have different standards. We expect perfection from, elected officials if they are women, but yet we allow things like clearly we allow misogyny, we allow a person with crimes and convicted crimes and sexual abuse crimes toward women, and we overlook that when it comes to a man. We have to start having real conversations in our country, and then we have to start working in solidarity with each other and not in siloed movements. Siloed movements is part of what got us here. When you vote for abortion rights only, which I'm very happy, I want to say that as a women's rights leader in this organization, I believe it's really positive. That was one of the outcomes, that we protected and restored abortion rights in some states. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that if we're voting for that, we should be voting for the freedoms of all people, even if they don't align with our one issue. So we have to move away from siloed movements and move toward working in unity together and solidarity for the equality and justice for everyone.
Christian Nunes, I appreciate the insight. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much.
And that is our program for this Thursday. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. I'm Michael Serapio. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.